Hi, I'm Phil Harbottle, and this is my 77th video discussing British science fiction publishing. In this video, I want to bring your attention to an important new book, The Fantastic Art of Ron Turner, published by Telos Books. Telos Publishing is a dynamic British small press set up by David Howe and Steve Walker in 2000, issuing both fiction and non-fiction in attractive hardcover editions in a variety of genres, and especially heavily illustrated coffee table style art books. Early in 2023, one of the cover artists, Martin Baines, suggested to them that Ron Turner would be a great subject for one of their books. Both David and Steve were admirers of Ron's work, and on making enquiries they discovered that my friend John Lawrence acted as agent for Ron's estate. So in February 2023 they contacted him to explore the possibilities. John told them that for over 20 years he'd been putting together material for a biography of Ron and was keen to see it in print. They quickly agreed on a format, and John then set to work preparing and refining his manuscript. Now, John and I had first met in 1981, and as mutual fans of Ron Turner, we soon became firm friends. My involvement with Turner and John has been covered in several of my earlier videos. After Turner's agent Greg Hall retired due to ill health, and Turner appointed John as his agent in 1984, we formed a partnership to publish new comic books and graphic novels for Ron to illustrate, for which I wrote the scripts. I'd also been assisting John on his planned biography of Ron Turner for many years. And after I became a literary agent, John asked me to act for him should the book ever be commissioned. In 2023, he informed me of Telos's interest and set to work in earnest on his biography. Then, a few months later, I received an email from one of John's daughters, Angela, with the sad news that John had died after a short illness, but had managed to write a near-complete draft of his manuscript, which she sent to me. Could I assist in ensuring that the book could still be published? Of course I could. I got in touch with Telos Books, who quickly finalised the contract for its publication. I then set about tracing Ron Turner's own family to get their contributions and family photographs for the book, which I was then able to complete. Working with Steve Walker, I made my own near-complete collection of Ron's work available for the illustrations. See some of the illustrations there. And also liaised with John's family to access his own even more complete collection for items I didn't have. The result of all our combined efforts has finally been published, The Fantastic Art of Ron Turner. In this book, the first ever comprehensive biography and bibliography of artist Ron Turner, John tells the story of Turner's lifelong dedication to producing quality artwork. The book is a journey through Turner's life from his birth in 1922 to his death in 1998, whilst detailing his career as an artist. If you look at some of the chapter headings there, you get some idea of the scope of the book. For decades, the full extent of Turner's mostly anonymous work had been shrouded in mystery, as had been the man himself. That would only begin to change when John traced and met Turner, eventually becoming his agent. The story of how this came about is vividly described in John's book, which also reveals the lifelong incredible dedication of John Lawrence himself in discovering and later promoting Turner's artwork. The book is in two parts. Book 1, which runs to 15 chapters, is a fascinating, extensively illustrated biography of Turner from his earliest days, tracing his career up to 1980. It includes the memoirs of Turner's 4 children paying tribute to their father with never-before-seen family photographs. All of these full-page illustrations you see are from the original artwork. There's Turner with his family, 4 children. And here are the memoirs of his family members about their father. Turner's eldest son is a very successful businessman, and his father did a lot of his catalogue and promotional illustrations for his company. See some of the artwork there. In his later years, Turner lived on the river, on a riverboat on the Thames. Did a lot of his work in his later years. Turner's daughter, Diane, and his youngest son, Mark, an artist in his own right. Turner became most famous for his work on the Daleks. And there he is, holding some of his original artwork. There's Turner's parents. Here we see the barracks where Ron Turner was born. John records that Ron displayed at school an aptitude for art and an interest in science, but it was after discovering during these formative years the novels of H.G. Wells, Jules Verne, and the scientific romances of Edgar Rice Burroughs that Turner quickly developed an interest in science fiction. In 1934, Ron came across the British science fiction magazine, Scoops, which introduced him to the work of John Russell Fearn, an author whose career would become closely linked to Ron's after 1950. The short-lived Scoops had whetted Ron's appetite for contemporary science fiction and led to his discovery of the American pulp magazines such as Amazing Stories and Astounding Stories, which had found their way to these shows as remainders. Not just the stories, but the highly imaginative cover artwork by Frank R. Paul, Leo Morey, and Hans Wessow, and others, made more of an impression on his young mind and stimulated his interest sufficiently for him to grab a pencil and copy what he saw. But it's when he began not only to copy, but to embellish these sketches with ideas of his own, that his mother recognised a creative talent emerging, and one which she actively encouraged him to develop. Ron's interest in science fiction was also inspired by such films as Things to Come, Metropolis, and the Flash Gordon serials and comic strips. Their visual imagery and style made a lasting impression. Now, during the war, see Turner's own experiences during the war, which he did in a comic strip biography, which I commissioned. Ron served overseas, active service overseas, for which he was decorated. He also survived a close encounter with a V2. And post-war, he became a technical artist at Odom Studios, doing undercover freelance work for Sky Unlimited, beginning with SF comic strips and romance book covers. There we see Turner's very earliest cover work, illustrating romance booklets. The romance booklets were actually written by John Russell Fearn under pseudonyms. Then, in 1950, his science fiction flair secured him a commission for the cover of Operation Venus by Fearn, quickly followed by the same author's Annihilation. Ron's outstanding colour covers helped successfully launch a regular series of novels, now appearing under the contractual pseudonym of Vargo Staton. See some of these covers here. Thereafter followed a long and fruitful association between the author and artist. As archetypical science fiction images, these covers have never been surpassed. They were typified by a dramatic realism, beautiful colouring, and an accurate depiction of the story. Later books often employed a kind of symbolism where 2 or 3 key plot elements were woven into a single picture. Turner's own interest in science and his training as a technical artist inspired him to reimagine the science fiction ideas he read into artistic renditions. The book abounds with behind-the-scenes details of his published work. In his text, John describes how Turner's first agent, Greg Hall, ensured that Turner remained in the background whilst he alone dealt with his publishers and editors. Hall was a shrewd and industrious agent, so that at first Turner's career flourished, and for 20 years he was inundated with work, quickly becoming the go-to man for science fiction and science fact illustrations in books, magazines, and comics. That's an especially interesting cover. For this one book, Turner painted the background, whilst the regular Hank Jansen artist was Reginald Heed. And Heed was famous for his portraits of beautiful women and girls, but he was unfamiliar with science fiction. And Turner's agent, Greg Hall, was also the agent at that time for Heed. So Heed did the girl and Turner painted the background. That fact was unknown for many years. These are all Turner covers. That was the only time Turner ever collaborated with another artist on a cover. This is an especially famous series, the Titbits science fiction series. Turner did all the covers for every book in the series. He also returned to doing comic strips. These are covers of comic books, also published by Titbits. There's his first cover for a science fact publication, Practical Mechanics. The science fiction comics were reprinted in France. There's a French cover. And then some more wonderful Practical Mechanics covers on space travel. This was the early 1950s, when there was a tremendous interest in science fiction and space exploration in Britain, following the boom in the Hollywood films of science fiction. Throughout a packed career that would eventually span 5 decades, Turner provided illustrations for the covers of innumerable science fiction paperbacks, popular comic strips, amongst his many comic strips. The most famous was Space Ace, which was his first page there. And he went on to create other comic strips such as Rick Random and the Daleks, for which he was especially famous. And in more recent years, Judge Dredd, Dan Dare and Nick Hazard. Over that time, Turner's beautifully drawn and incredibly detailed renditions of spacecraft, aliens and futuristic machines, all convincingly and dramatically presented, earned him his well-deserved reputation as the master of science fiction illustration. There we go. That's the Rick Random. Did a couple of covers for the Super Detective Library series. There's a Rare Western cover which he did for a book by E.C. Tubb. more at random. Technical illustrations. These books are avidly collected today. They're real collector's items. These pages are especially interesting. Here we see examples of the master paintings Turner did for Craftmaster paint by numbers kits in the early 1960s. Beautiful images of animals and scenes around the world on land and sea. He's especially noted for his illustrations for the Jerry Anderson television spin-offs, comic spin-offs from the TV series of Stingray and Thunderbirds and so forth, with Jerry Anderson. And then his real breakthrough came when he was chosen to illustrate the Daleks on the back of TV 21, the Anderson comic. And there we see his dynamic artwork for the Daleks, which he made it his own. Thunderbirds, Daleks. But in the 1970s, as the publishing industry changed, his career had began to falter. As a freelance commercial artist, Ron was dependent on whatever assignments his agent, Greg Hall, could secure for him. And when they became involved with IPC, things took a turn for the worse. IPC provided inferior juvenile scripts and increasingly non-science fiction work, together with grueling weekly deadlines that prevented Ron from maintaining his own high standards. The inside story on Ron's association with IPC is revealed for the first time in John's book in fascinating detail. All attempts by publishers and editors and even fans to contact Ron had been met by Hall's indomitable wall of silence. Turner himself became a mystery man. No publisher knew him or knew of anyone who'd ever met him. And despite many efforts to track him down by various writers, editors and fans, all attempts had failed. Eventually, Ron began to lose science fiction work that should have been his by right of his outstanding ability. There's some of his Jerry Anderson annuals work. But increasingly, he became involved with juvenile, non-science fiction work. There were occasional exceptions, such as when he did Star Trek for a short while, but that was only as a fill-in to the regular artist who was ill. And then he was back to non-science fiction stuff. which was a waste of his talents. There we see examples of IPC put him to work on juvenile stuff. That was a waste of his talents. Now, amongst the fans who tried to discover who Turner was John himself, and his book reveals how, against all odds, he finally managed to break through that wall erected by the agent. John relates how he was able to track Ron down and become his friend, colleague, and eventual working partner. John describes how he got to know Ron very well, and despite the artist being a very private person, he revealed to him a great deal about his life and work, which is included in the first part of this book. Now, most modern readers will be completely unaware of many of the details of Turner's life and career, so practically all of the book's revelations of Turner's relationships with editors and publishers will be of absorbing interest. Why did Turner not draw all of the Rick Random stories? Why was he taken off Judge Dredd? Why did IPC and their successors Fleetway not use him on more serious science fiction strips, instead of making him waste his talents on children's sports strips and comedic juvenile adventure stories? John's narrative gives the answer to these and many more mysteries. Eventually, Turner diversified into doing war stories. Now, these weren't juveniles, and as a veteran of the Second World War himself, Turner was very familiar with his subject matter, and these war picture libraries, as they became known, represent some of his very best work. There's the brief time he worked on Judge Dredd before he was dismissed from the project. Turner's agent protested that the publisher wasn't using him to his best advantage, and he was given this semi-science fiction strip, The Spinball Wars. That's just reassured a return to form. There was an example, he was given a science fiction strip, but it was a very juvenile strip. And was eventually taken off that and given a Speedway strip to illustrate it. Occasionally he would fill in for another artist, and that's a very famous series, Charlie's War. Turner just did one story in that series, but he did an outstanding job, as you can see. There's more examples of his wilderness years working for IBC Juvenile Comics. Occasionally, despite himself, Turner did do some outstanding work for the juveniles. That was for the Eagle Annual, Eagle Summer Special, I think, that one. That's an especially interesting panel there. It's the only time Turner ever signed his comic strips, and that was because the incident in the story he was illustrating mirrored his own real life experience in the Second World War, where his commanding officer was killed in a battle at Cassini in Italy. And Turner was so moved by the parallels that he signed a strip, as John reveals in his text. And here we come to part 2. Now, book 2, also 15 chapters, details how John, on becoming Ron's agent in 1984, formed a partnership with me to publish new comic books and graphic novels for Ron to illustrate. Now, as I mentioned earlier, I wrote comic strips with John, especially for Turner. And with John acting as editor, each story was deliberately written to give Ron the opportunity to draw the iconic science fiction imagery he loved to create, and they included 3 Nick Hazard stories and other graphic novels and short stories, most notably Fern's The Golden Amazon and E.C. Tubbs' Calgon the Golden. Nick Hazard. Brief stint on Dan Day for the Eagle Annual. Hazard story there. Calgon the Golden, which I adapted from an E.C. Tubb story. These are private commissions which John got for Turner. Because IPC not providing any science fiction comic strip work, he did some private commissions. That's a Nick Hazard comic that John created for him. You see the cover of Calgon the Golden. Nick Hazard story. But despite our best efforts, we were unable to sustain our comic book line in the United States and had to disband it. The full story is given in John's book. But Ron Turner didn't end his association with us. Instead, it entered an entirely new phase. John continued to find him other commissions, and whilst I began developing a new career as a science fiction book editor and literary agent. At John's prompting, Turner also returned to painting his favourite colour strip, The Daleks, from new scripts especially written for him by John, with the work being published by Marvel Comics in their Doctor Who magazine. His earlier classic Daleks work for TV 21 has since continued to be widely reprinted. And as we're seeing, from the early 1980s, I'd also privately commissioned Ron to paint covers for the remainder of Fern's science fiction novels that he hadn't illustrated the first time around. At the back of my mind, I never lost faith in the belief that I would eventually find publishers willing to reprint Fern's novels, and when that happened, I wanted them to feature a Ron Turner cover. My belief was well-founded, and many wonderful Ron covers have appeared and continue to appear posthumously, especially on books published in the United States. That's perhaps one of the best of the new covers that Ron painted for me on a John Russell Fern book he hadn't illustrated when it first appeared in 1952. But when the story was later reprinted, I was able to use the new Turner cover. That's a famous scene, the creature from the Black Lagoon. Turner didn't illustrate that book when it was first published. That was done by John Richards, but I had Turner paint his own cover for Creature from the Black Lagoon, and these are new paintings for Borgo Staten books, which he didn't illustrate the first time round. And these books have all since been reprinted, and the new editions, of course, have Turner covers. That's a page from the comic strip I wrote for Turner. Tried to sell it to the Eagle, but the editor, David Hunt, said the story was too advanced for its young readership, so it was rejected, but it was eventually published many years later. This cover is of a special significance to me. After my father died in 1992, as John describes in his text, I discovered that he'd actually been a member of a local Tynemouth Writers Club and had written his own short stories and articles about life in the northeast. And when I found these papers in his effect, I decided to gather them up and publish them as a book, which was distributed to friends and relatives at their father's funeral. And Ron Turner did a rush commission, and he painted a lovely cover for me, a wraparound cover, with this Viking story, the Vikings landing in Tynemouth. And that's one of the interior illustrations. Eventually, John obtained a commission for Turner to return to illustrating the Daleks. And I see some of his new Dalek work there. Now, the first and most significant publisher, when John and I strove to get Turner reintroduced to science fiction, was Griffin Books, the New York small press run by Gary Levisi. Beginning in 1995, Gary commissioned a whole series of science fiction and crime novels from my client authors, all with new Ron Turner covers. Scores of titles would be published over the next 2 decades, and Gary was instrumental in helping me resurrect Turner's career. All of the covers are featured in John's book. Wildside. Griffin books. There we see the new science fiction work which Turner did, mostly on John Russell Fearn novels, Golden Amazon series, crime novels. There we see some more crime novels. E.C. Tubb, rare gangster novel by E.C. Tubb. Michael Avalone, very famous American crime writer. That's an interesting image there. That is a portrait of Turner's agent, Greg Hall. They're cast as a bit of a villain in the story. More beautiful covers for Griffin books. He did some inside illustrations as well for some of the early books. This one is especially interesting. For a while I became the scriptwriter for the Garth strip in the Daily Mirror, and I had Turner to illustrate one of my Garth stories, Twilight World. Turner illustrated there. There's the new Dalek series, which John wrote for Turner, and it was published in Doctor Who magazine. Griffin book cover by E.C. Tubb. More Griffin covers. That's Turner's final pages of the new Dalek series. So with this Griffin book series, Turner's career in science fiction was well and truly revived. In his final years of doing the work he loved to do were happy ones. And thanks to new computer technology, John and I were finally able to have our 1950s graphic strips work with Turner republished in more befitting full-size format, on slick paper and in full colour, in John's own magazine, Space Ace, colourised by artist John Ridgway, and in Spaceship Away, colourised by Martin Baines. It's one of Martin Baines's Golden Amazon colourisations. And Martin is currently colouring the E.C. Tubb comic strip, Calgon the Golden, and that's currently being reprinted in Spaceship Away today. The book also contains peer reviews, tributes by Turner's peers, including the likes of John Freeman and famous artist David Gibbons, Dave Gibbons, paying the tribute to Turner. And the book ends with a full bibliography of all Turner's works from 1950, year by year. John and I researched every piece of artwork that Turner did during his entire lifetime as a commercial artist. Most of these books in later years are still in print today, because a lot of them were print on demand editions, and they're still in print, and you can find them on Amazon. That was one of John's private commissions for Turner. He asked them to reimagine the famous film Forbidden Planet with Robbie the Robot, and that's Turner's take on the famous film. Now, one item I want to refer to, bibliography, is that picture there, the multi-man. Now this book, John's book, has inspired me to resume writing a new updated version of my own 1968 book, The Multi-Man. On the life and work of John Russell Fearn. Now, I'd commissioned Ron Turner to paint this cover in 1988, but I had to abandon the book as I was unable to discover all of Fearn's remaining pseudonyms at that time. But I continued my researches and finally completed my collection quite recently. And that being the case, I hope to complete the new book in a few months' time. I invite any interested publisher to get in touch. And finally, we see the author himself, John Lawrence. There he is in his later years as his family knew him. It's tragic that John didn't live to see the result of his hard work, but I like to think he would be pleased with this book.